So this session has like not really like a pre-established format, or we want this to be like a conversation and give you the possibility to ask questions to some of our speakers. So you can see like they are all over here and some back there. Hi, Dave. So we can just kick it off, like if anyone have any particular questions. Otherwise, I'm gonna like throw some, you know, sticks on the fire here and get things started. I don't know how to say that, but hay on the fire. That's what you're saying.
We just was having a conversation about knock and.
Oh yes, we were having this really fun conversation about. Pedro was talking to a company that had knock. A site reliability operations team, a DevOps team, and a site reliability engineering team. And at least 4 problems to resolve, right?
They have 5 problems, 4 teams, and then getting rid of all of them.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, do you guys have any particular questions? We have like a lot of, yeah. You don't need to go to the microphone. It's just like I sound loud because I sound
they're all
loud.
on, so.
I sort of like a softball question, like what's the most challenging thing your individual organization is faced today?
Ah.
Hiring.
Besides hiring.
How do we do this? There's too many of us.
Well, we can, I mean, like a lot of us didn't build a lot of, like a huge organization, so we can start filtering by that. I think we have like 2, 3. But I think Pedro, Philip probably have something to say, and like, well,
What size?
yeah.
What size do you want that
I think you got
answer?
the raise. I think you got nominated for the
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, so I was one of the maybe 2 SREs at Airbnb. So I've kind of been there from like the point where we basically just had no idea what we were doing as far as like what boxes existed and like how we were going to spin them up and stuff, unto the point where now we have like a pretty good handle on that stuff. Like we have a lot of processes for, you know, managing machines and managing configurations and like managing monitoring and like managing deploys. We've like built a lot of that stuff ourselves. Some of it we've open sourced, some of it we haven't. But yeah, I mean, like, I think that a lot of the companies here that are kind of larger, like they've maybe solved their scaling issues. Like it's maybe like not like a huge deal to like bring up like some amount of capacity for like, I don't know, like for us, it's like really the challenging problem is like, this thing might just like, crash at any moment. Like we're literally just like keeping it going, like, and it doesn't matter, like we have not like escaped the problem that like next week will bring more users than we've ever seen, and that is like difficult to deal with. And it comes, and like more users internally in terms of engineers like pushing code and trying to deploy features, and like some of them are like new hires and they don't know what they're doing and all that stuff. And also more users in terms of like visitors trying to use the site and like the ever larger data sets that they bring and all that stuff. So that, I mean, it's just the same old ops challenges, like it's crashing from both sides.
I'd say at Netflix, one of the things that we struggle with is figuring out the right model and figuring out when to change things. So we've had a NOC, we've had DevOps, we've had a centralized reliability team. Now we're trying to do a hybrid where the developers that are developing the features also own the on-call, and then you kind of complement that with reliability engineers that are in the domain with also ones that are centralized. But being willing to say, okay, we might go across from generalist to specialist, and being willing to change, I think, is the philosophy we have, but the struggle is actually making it work.
Yeah, so from Netflix as well, Philip runs like an engineering team, and I'm more of a central organization, and so finding that balance, we had the luxury of, from the beginning, you know, the engineering teams are on call, they push their own code for the most part, they operated, and now we're finding that we're getting to a large enough organization that we need to, I wouldn't say take some of that responsibility back, but we just have to have a lot of discussions about how can we help you solve this operational space effectively, and some teams want to give that up and some don't, so finding that balance is what's our challenge right now.
I add sort of, I think Netflix is probably a little bit larger than us, and I think Airbnb is like significantly smaller than Dropbox, but for us it's been sort of operational excellence across like all of engineering. Like how do we start to get that outside of just infrastructure, which has that culture and has built that culture? How do you get, you know, how do you convince product teams that they should also have that sort of they need to be as excellent as infrastructure is to like when they run their products. And that's a challenge because it's just a very different set of values. Like we've been very good and very crisp about defining like what our value system is inside of infrastructure, which is where SRE lives for us. But the rest of engineering hasn't necessarily like said, here are the values that we have aside from company values. So making sure those align has been a big challenge.
So I think we have two big challenges. One is as the organization has grown, communication has been definitely something that's been difficult, making sure that you have the right people engaged in the right project, but also just in general that you don't have pockets of either engineering teams or production engineering teams that are building the same thing that they just haven't talked to each other about. So that's one of the biggest problems that we have. And we've tried a lot of different solutions and generally have done okay at it, but I don't think we've done awesome at it. And then the other one is, I think what Andrew was saying here, or actually, I can't remember your name.
Igor?
Igor, thank you, from Airbnb. He was saying that when you solve some of the challenges that you needed at the beginning stages of a company, it's not the same thing as you needed later on in the company. And so the challenge that we have right now is that we will be getting to that point where a lot of the things that we had to do before are no longer things that we actually have to pay attention to as much. The people that did those things don't necessarily evolve with the stages of the company. And so finding roles for the people that actually like the earlier aspects of the company, the bootstrapping phases, aren't necessarily the ones that are going to get more meticulous and more challenged over time. And so keeping them happy, understanding that they have engagement, and then finding the right roles for them is tough and will get tougher.
How have some of your companies decided between build versus buy? In other words, I mean, I'm looking at there's probably
We only build.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Different monitoring systems. You know, there's all these open source initiatives out there.
Yeah, so we actually, sorry, I had the mic, so I'm just going to answer that. Mostly we do the same thing. We actually mostly build because of the scale that we have. There's very few things that are off the shelf that we could actually implement that would handle the onslaught of usage. Although a couple of years ago, we went through the build versus buy decision for configuration management at the systems layer. And so what it came down to, the simplest answer to that is, if it can get us somewhere between 85 and 90% of the way there, and then we have to do the last 10 to 15% and engineer our way to be able to make it scale, then we'll probably do that because it'll get us there faster, right? And we're big proponents of open source at Facebook. We have benefited significantly from it. So we try to actually do that same thing over and over again, which is if there's something that we can actually get to our scale and we could spend some engineering time and effort to make the broader community better, like we'll actually try to do that. So.
And that's one of the biggest problems when you're bootstrapping. You know, when you're a small company, you can't build everything. So how do you buy? I mean, I miss being in an environment where we built our own hardware also because, oh my God, you know, it's like Rumble's still, no, who's the guy who woke up after 20 years? Rip Van Winkle waking up and being like, really, the hardware industry is just gotten exponentially worse? But more to the point of your question, we also do the 80% rule, but we have to buy a lot, and also that means, you know, vendor management is a big part of what we do, and luckily we found certain people on the team like to do that, so we kind of let them do that a lot, and saves the rest of the team from having to do it.
Do you think that leveraging like open source tools might be a way? Because if you do that, then you can actually like make the tool, change the tools as you need until it becomes too painful, and then you go, and at that point you might be in a size you can rewrite it yourself.
Good point. When I say buy, I kind of lumped in also all the open source stuff we use. I mean, we have gigabytes of RAM in you know, used by Redis and other things. So that's less vendor management, more, you know, gluing everything together.
Yeah, Twitter, talking about open source specifically, we use open source mainly for two things. One, so that we can offload some of the sort of general maintenance, or like we don't have infinite resources to make all those little bits and pieces better, and so we open source things so that they can, write that little binary driver for us, or binary little thing that we can then pull back in. But also the bigger point I think sometimes is we open source it so that other people use it, and then we can hire them because they're familiar with the things that we do. Unfortunately, that's the reality.
I was gonna say, I think there's actually like a pretty big elephant in the room too, which is like AWS, GCE, and like Azure. Like, I think if you count those, I think many, many more people are buying versus building in general. Like, I think there's a software on top of it, right? Which I think most places are still saying like we're gonna build that, like including like probably Netflix as well. But there's like the infrastructure component or the platform, like people are buying that, right? Like that's fairly, I think, aside from like probably the big 3 or 4, like everyone is doing that now.
I also wanted to add that I was part of the Memcache team at Facebook, so we effectively took open source Memcached and tried to make it better. And we had the issues with like buying versus building, or like effectively trying to like contribute back on a lot of the stuff, is that we have a lot of changes internally on this open source software that we've done to make it performant and have different focus. And oftentimes our internal roadmaps or our change sets aren't in disagreement with what the open source community wants to do with these changes, right? Which it makes it, then you have this question of incentive structure. Do you spend the time in like backporting these changes, syncing back up with open source and like all that, a lot of man time to get all that working, right? Versus just saying like, you know what, we're gonna fork and we're gonna do our own thing. And the other flip side of it also is that just for something like Memcached, in which we put a lot of effort into it, we can't just willy-nilly open source it, because we have to be very cognizant of the fact that because a company like Facebook puts a Memcached out there, people are just going to assume that, oh, it's Facebook's Memcached, it must be performant, it must be great, it must work. But the truth of it is that it's not actually 100% compatible with the open source. So if we put something out there, people are just going to drop and replace it, and then their infrastructure is going to break in extremely subtle ways, right, and causing a lot of people a lot of harm, and doesn't help anybody. So I think when it comes to buying versus building or working with open source, there's a lot of nuance that has to be addressed.
Scribe, yes.
I'll just say, I mean, you guys all know Google builds its own stuff. But I've been in Google a long time, and we definitely went through a period where we actually asked this question about everything we were working on. And I think that one of the things you want to think about when you're evaluating, like especially when you're smaller, like are you going to buy, is you need to think about how long it's going to last you. And when you add dependencies on your infrastructure, on this solution, you have to engineer or at least be cognizant that you're probably going to outgrow it if you're successful, which is ideally your goal. So think about when you're doing this analysis, like how long it's going to last you and what you're going to do at the end of that life cycle. So.
So we had a case where we did a similar thing with Memcache, where being in the cloud, being in multiple availability zones, we didn't have replication needs, so we built a layer on top of that. And more recently, we wanted to use Redis, right, a little more complex sort of data structure around the data available in Memcache. And so we just created an open source component called Dynamite, which is a Redis multi-AZ replication driver, right? And so we find those cases where there isn't an existing solution for our stack and we build it. In the case of performance monitoring tools, we typically crush most of them. And at some point, it's okay being someone's performance and reliability guinea pig, right? Like, okay, let's break it again. And so we're using a more measured approach now, right? Which is, well, what is the tool set good for? So we look at a lot of APM tools. They try to solve everything. They want to have a CTO dashboard. They want to give you your profiling data. They want to be your source of logs. And it's just too broad for what we need. And so we'll build tools for a very point solution that the general, I think, third-party product is trying to solve for the whole company. And it's great for a top 10 organization. As you get bigger, you only want like one of those 10 features. So why do you need to bring along the other 9? You know?
Yeah, that's the same thing we had with Redis and Memcache, the same sort of thing, where we needed specific features for our specific use cases, and the rest of it we didn't really care about.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I like one thing that I've said. Netflix is interesting because you have one extreme example of Buy, which is using AWS for running our application infrastructure. Another extreme example of Build, which is building out legacy Oracle. And so it's this very unique balance. You ask yourself, what are we going to be great at? And we're going to be great at changing your application, improving the features over time. So we use Amazon for that. We also want to be great at getting the bits as fast as we can from the disk out of the pipes. And so we buy and sort of build that right there. So you can do a balancing of both of those depending on what your company is.
So I have a question. So I'm a very small company, obviously, and I'm just curious, like, how do you kind of do the balance between like availability and features? Because
I mean, at Twitter, our biggest thing has been we're extremely we ran some numbers last week. We counted of all the services that have deployed something in the last, I think it was 6 months or something. We counted up all those unique ones. We have 1,100 services that we've deployed of something in production, just production. So if we spin up a new service for some feature, we generally make it a new service. And so it's really easy. If it doesn't work well, if it's under capacity, we just turn it off, and then whatever. So that's kind of the starting point. I mean, that's an advantage of us because we're extremely service-oriented architecture. If you're a monolithic architecture, that's a lot harder. But get to that.
So what I would suggest is that you focus on what the business goals are, and sort of tie it back to, you know, like what are you trying to accomplish? What are the minimum requirements in terms of sort of availability and latency, and are you hitting those? An error budget is something that you earn over time by sort of exceeding the thresholds, the minimum thresholds that you've set. And so, like, once you have a clear understanding from sort of product through development through SRE that you're all working towards the same goal, and that goal meets the needs of the company, and then you've sort of exceeded that goal, then you have bought yourself room to do additional experimentation.
So I don't think any of that will happen in a realistic environment, in a typical environment, because the default or typical management structure just puts into place all the wrong incentives. In fact, typical management structures put incentives that will prevent every one of those suggestions from ever happening. So this is a problem that needs to be solved at the executive level. They have to set up a structure that makes the product management concerned with uptime in a way that affects their bonus.
I don't know if it's about money particularly, but...
Well, so the Ben Trainer's recommendation from his keynote last year was the budget for staffing should be one bucket for SREs and developers, so that product management has the choice. We can have a more reliable site, or we could have more features, but we can't. But one plays off the other, and other management structures will achieve the same goal. But if you don't have something like that, I think that's first, and then all these other things come from it.
I think a lot depends on what you're trying to do in terms of spending the error budget. You know, like if you're spending the error budget by running things hotter, you know, and sort of reducing your cost, then you're going to get a lot of management support.
So I actually think in small organization you can actually do one better than.
I think Sabrina's been trying to talk for a while.
Oh, sorry. So go ahead.
No one cares. I think, unlike Tom, I won't disagree with what everyone has said. I will instead agree with what everyone has said.
I'll disagree with Tom in a second.
Wait, I've lost track.
So I think that I see this trap a lot, right? Where an SRE will go and say availability is the most important thing, and that is not a message that works necessarily with the product team. And we can say you have to align it with your business. You know, I've seen people say this is very expensive on the team, you're burning out the team. It's like they also don't care about that. So in general, and so I think that when you really should spend time with the decision makers of the company and talk about what is important to them, both short-term and long-term. And then when you need something, you frame it in that context for them to be able to translate what you're asking for with their priorities.
Yeah, so I actually was going to slightly disagree with what Tom was saying here, which is, yes, the executive team does have an incentive structure to actually push out new features and, you know, make it the whiz-bang new thing that everybody wants, and faster time to market, yada, yada, yada. Like, all those things are actually probably good incentives. From a site reliability perspective, you have to understand what the trade-offs are, right? And I think this is the hardest thing that we actually don't do well as like a sort of profession, I guess. There's no easy way for you to show that if you focused on this availability feature or this performance or this efficiency feature, there was an impact to the business, right? And so if you can do that, I'd suggest you start with that. And so in Facebook's history, this was actually a really big problem. Initially, it was performance and efficiency, reliability and availability are the things that we're actually like focusing on now, more than we used to before. But what we did was we set up a complete team whose focus was what would the impact to the business and the users and the growth and the advertising side of it B, if we were faster, if we actually loaded the site faster, et cetera, et cetera. And we had very specific metrics that we were looking at that said, if you make the site 25% faster, your revenue grows by X. And so as soon as we showed that, everybody's like, oh shit, we should do that, right? So if you can have a way to prove that the work that you're doing has an impact to the business, then that's the way to do it.
So the only thing I'd add, because I think one of the things, the impression I'm getting right now is that I think the rest of everyone else here is mostly from like larger scale organizations, and I think the approach there does not work for like the smaller. I think SignalFX is probably less than 30, 40 people. I think you actually can build that relationship with the product team and with the people that you're working with. I think it's actually much more effective that way than trying to go the error budget route, or even sort of building an organization saying like, hey, this is the impact I can provide to the business, right? Because it comes down to prioritization, right? Do you want to spend your time building that? Because now you have to build another system just to prove the thing you were trying to prove to start with. Like that conversation you can have, like just going to have lunch with the product manager and like talking about it, get them on the same page with you, like building that relationship is like 10, 20, 30 times more effective. I would say it's like, it probably carries you to like a couple hundred people even in the organization. Like I still find it effective at Dropbox with like 300 engineers, like just meeting with engineering leadership and like if they're on the same page as I am and I'm on the same page as they are in terms of like what Sabrina was saying, like what the business needs are, the right thing will happen. Like availability, I don't know necessarily like at your scale is like it's a little different because you're a monitoring company, so maybe it is like like you have to have that number, but I think it's you have to be in line with them and you have to build that relationship. I think it's very important, especially at that scale, that you don't have the divisive culture of SRE and like software engineering or DevOps or like whatever those lines are, that they're very blurry. That like they feel the same pain you feel the same pain they feel, and both sides are on the same page.
And you have the data, right? Like the interesting thing is you're coming out with like availability is really important, right? That's your final conclusion. But if you take a few steps back and just look at your data and present your data, right, with a different perspective, which is the perspective that you would get by meeting with them.
Well, I mean, so the problems that I'm potentially facing might even come before those, right? So like having the data is great, but like being able to measure those kinds of things, like getting the support of like people who own various services to even measure, say, latency of something going through their system, or like how to measure this properly, because like it may go through a queue and then jump through.
You're a monitoring company.
That's what you're about.
Well, that's
yeah, I think you just walk in and say that.
How do you kind of like get like I guess getting buy-in is just building those relationships.
I mean,
I think
like,
identify why they think it's hard.
yeah,
right?
no engineer wants your system to not work, right? Like if I'm just like a product engineer and I'm building a product, like it is not my goal to like break everything. Like I would like things to be reliable, like I want my features to be seen by users. And like I think that one way to make that happen is to like have like some angry SRE standing over my desk who says like, oh, you're doing this like incorrectly. I think like you get a lot from like, for instance, like you're saying that you have a service that has got high latency, right? Like you can calculate exactly how much latency you can give to a particular service before it starts affecting like the parent calling service, right? Like if it makes like this percentage of requests, and like if those requests take a certain percentage of time, then like all my workers for the parent service will be tied up like making requests to the service after a certain amount of time, right? So if you just like build an automatic circuit breaking system that like calculates that budget and just tells that person, hey, your service is getting circuit broken because it's like consuming its latency budget, like then you don't have to be the angry SRE. Like it is just like the system is doing the correct thing, and you've also eliminated a source of instability. I think it's just like a matter of tooling, right? Like it's a matter of tooling and collaboration. Like one problem is building that system, and the second problem is like making sure that those people know that that exists. So like I think the second thing that I would work on in like such a situation, and that's like the kind of things that I've been working on, has been to like build in automated alerting on stuff like this, so that the correct people get notified about when their specific pieces of the larger infrastructure are causing problems. So like make it automatic to like deal with the problems, and then like make sure that people know that there are problems, and the people will fix the problems. Like I just think nobody wants to be the broken stuff.
Yeah, I had two things. One is I think understanding who's most important for your availability, like or the reliability component, and identifying who is non-critical. So in our company, probably like Twitter, we have a lot of services that explode. I mean, our biggest footprint growth isn't necessarily existing system growth to user behavior. It's new services coming out, right, to drive the business. And so it's this large footprint growth, and going to the organization and saying, our availability sucks, let's fix it. and everybody has to apply the same amount of sort of pain. If you can identify critical versus non-critical, like my pre-compute services, they can be 2 nines, I don't care, right? But the front door ones, I'm gonna be extremely strict in working with them and try to come to a solution that really matters for our end user. I could call from the audience. Jeremy's back there from Pinterest, and I've been picking his brain on how they push data to all their services each week about their availability and their contribution to that. And so we're in a similar model where how do we get the context back? Because most teams want to make the right choice, but a lot of them don't have the data. So like if you say we have all these teams, how do we measure it? You guys have to solve that if you care about it and get them the data. And then, because if they don't have the context, you can't expect them to make the right decisions, right? That's usually the challenge we have.
I also wanted to add, one of the things that sort of comes to mind when I think about this is as SREs, as people, we often come across as saying, you must have high availability always. And I think of that in the context, like my canonical example is a bank thinks that it's okay for their website to be down for 8 hours every Saturday. And I'm like, that makes sense for them. So you kind of have to and they probably, I assume, employ ops or SRE people or whatever. And that's part of the problem you're trying to solve. And so actually coming across not as we must have high availability as a sort of axiom, but something that you derive from, we are a monitoring company, or people depend on us, or therefore, and then how you follow that through, that tends to be a little bit more effective than trying to assert my own rightness.
I think just kind of to recap what a lot of people said, I think the new way forward is not to be, ops is responsible for uptime, but SRE is responsible for making sure that everyone has the tools so everyone can be responsible for uptime. So you have to get out of that ops business and be the empowering group.
Hi. So we've got like a fairly bifurcated dev and ops organization right now, and within our ops team, actually over half of the team is remote, and the ops team is sort of running more of a traditional sort of knock role, and we're looking to sort of come up with a way to better integrate our ops with our development to based on what a lot of people have said here and a lot of helpful suggestions. But one of the things that we're really struggling with is how are we going to get the rest of the company to work with these remote people? How can we integrate these remote people into these teams when they're not physically in the same room? Have any of you guys dealt with this sort of?
You have a really hard problem.
So Stack is a remote worker first company. Even though only less than half of our engineers are remote, we've adopted the policy that everything we do has to work well for the remote people. So it's everybody's responsibility to make sure that the remote people don't get isolated. It's also it's part of our culture that remote people have a way of speaking up and saying, hey, I'm feeling isolated and need a hug. So there's a couple different tools that we have. I mean, if you want to get into the tactical stuff, we use a chat room with history, right? So people can always read and get caught up. And that's our main communication forum. So even though I work out of the New York City office, and so does one of my coworkers, and we're 5 feet from each other, we chat in the chat room so that everyone can see it. We pop into video hangouts on drop of a hat so that there's no friction to it's not like, oh, do you want a video chat about it? It's let's just chat and talk about it. So it's nothing special. So a lot of it is the communication tools. And then the other is just this culture of design documents that are reviewed, transparency in a way that works for remote people.
So one of what I would say makes the problem you have challenging, right, is that it's very difficult for people to know the people who are remote. How can they trust them? What do they know? What do they go to them for, right? And so what I think you're going to need to set up is a way for people to present the quality of their work, right? Maybe that is in presentations where everyone's required to present to everyone else, or maybe that's that their design docs must be defended or something. You want a forum where people can get to know them, that they don't have to be face-to-face. At a minimum, you have to do that.
I forgot to mention that of these remote people, most of them are also in Europe. So with the rest of us being in like EST, that's about like a 6-hour difference. So not only are they remote, but like they tend to be like asleep.
The thing, one of the things that can help in this kind of situations, like as you bootstrap, like for instance, let's say you make a plan, right? Like everything starts with a plan. Okay, we plan to have like this team more embedded with the specific development teams. And to bootstrap that, if you have the opportunity to actually fly people to be together for a while to establish the relationships, and then they go back to being remote, and then they come back and like they meet face to face once in a while, that's a way to actually make sure that they don't become strangers. That you can try with VC and like phone and IRC, or like using asynchronous communication as much as you need. But one of the things that we have learned, like trying to make, Angelo is sitting here, so like trying to make the Dublin team work well, and like now London and stuff like that, is that you need face-to-face time with the people, and that is nothing that actually replaces like just having that contact. So you need to find a way to build that into the work flow that you have with the teams. Maybe like, oh, every 6 months everybody gets together for 2 weeks and they are gonna work together on like a hackathon style, whatever, like, you know.
So to follow up to that, for your European offices, are they like very SRE focused, or do they have their own dev team that supports them? So that like, for instance, like
Dublin doesn't have it. Dublin is only production engineering. London, we have production engineering and software engineering together. So it's a lot of like, they need to understand very well what their role is, and have, even if they are very deeply connected or interdependent as in a mission with the team that is here in the Bay Area, they need to be independent for executing, otherwise they can't make progress, right? Like, so it's a combination of planning together and executing separately with autonomy, because the worst thing that can happen to an engineer that works in Europe, and I worked for Google for 6.5 years in Zurich, is that you get there in the morning and the diff you had out for review is still pending review, and you know that you're only going to get a review maybe tomorrow morning. And that you just can't do things like that.
Two small things, I don't know if they'll apply to you, but two things we do at Stack. One is our European people all try to rendezvous at the same conference once a year, so that they turn it into a mini meetup. That helps them on that side of the pond. The other thing is, and we stole this idea from Etsy, we have an internal website that's flashcards of, it shows a picture of a coworker and 3 possible names, and you have to guess who it is. And it's a really good way of like quizzing yourself and forcing you to learn everyone's face. Yeah.
So one of the other things that, as we're building out remote offices, is one, I think, to echo what Nando was saying, like, we're definitely saying the SWE and SRE teams have to be attached to each other. We don't ever put an SRE team without a SWE team. I actually went as far as saying we won't do a Dropbox SRE team in Europe this year because SWE wasn't out ready to do it, because I wouldn't move the SRE team once the SWE team was there. I think it has to be a conversation, because otherwise you end up with like somebody will become a second-class citizen to someone else, whether it's either SRE or it's SWE. Someone is going to be asked to move if you don't both agree that this is what you should be doing. So I think it's like very super important that that actually happens. And I think a lot of us up here seem to be like, the common thread for like the last couple of questions has been, this has to be much more of a kind of relationship building thing. It is very much a FaceTime thing, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. Like, you have to put the time in. I think a lot of people at conferences like this tend to think of people as machines, and like they're ones and zeros, but they're not. And like actually going and building the relationship is like the most important thing you can do. It's the only way the organization like thrives.
David.
So I'm wondering if the esteemed panel would tender a pie in the sky question. My question for anybody who wants to answer this is, I think that every field has its grand challenge questions. The things that are considered like, we're not there yet, maybe we'll never get there, but these really big things that we should be working on. And I'm just curious what people in the panel think they are for SRE. Ideally, something less
I think I know Pedro has a whole speech. I know Pedro has a whole speech on that, like branding.
Thank you, Nanda. Yeah, so actually there's a couple of really big challenges. Showing people what we do, like who the hell are we, what are we doing, why are we doing it, why is it important, like that's the biggest problem that we have. In fact, I mean, I'm so excited that we actually had this conference and it's now the second time. Like more people want to do it. There's one in Dublin that's coming up, so thank you very much. But like actually getting that out there, right, and being like there is this subset of the technology industry that actually does this type of work, but nobody really knows how to assign it or figure out what it is that they're actually doing. The other is education. Like you don't learn this, you still don't learn this in school. You still only learn it by doing it. And that actually then skews some of the numbers towards the people that are doing it right now to be more experienced individuals, which is way harder to find in the industry anyway. And so we're all fighting against each other basically to actually find those people. But there are very few places, computer science departments, any of the academics who actually think that this is a discipline that should be taught. And if it is a discipline that should be taught, then what do we do with it? How do we actually teach it? What are the things that we want to get people to understand? Like nobody, as far as I know, is actually trying to solve that problem. So I think as a community, like that is our biggest challenge.
This is a kind of a good complement to your first one, which is when are we done? What is success for a Twitter SRE for a service or something like that? So,
never.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a problem sometimes when we have that natural instinct. Like I think there's a lot of legacy thinking from the SA world of like we're operations and the operations never stops. Well, no, like software engineers don't have this mentality. They don't come up join writing a service with the expectation they're going to be writing that service forever. They're going to move on to some other service and and build the next thing. Why do we have the different philosophy? So I think, there are cases obviously that we're always going to have some operational component to every service that we run, and that will never end as long as our organizations continue to exist and have users going to their websites. But you have to go in with the mentality of saying, where do I want to be with this system, this service, this thing that we've built? And because otherwise you're just gonna be a self-fulfilling prophecy of being the operational person who just constantly fixes and refixes things. Like how can you go in and say, all right, this thing has all these X, Y, Z problems. How can I eliminate all those problems and then walk away?
I'd like to propose that we declare that we're done at 5 o'clock. No, I mean that we have work-life balance and that we're... So I'm very optimistic about the education front. A lot of university professors are all of a sudden saying, oh, this is important. I need to figure out how to teach this and sell it to the university. And a lot of this, I've gotten a lot of feedback. I'm not here to plug my book, but Strata and I and Christine just co-wrote a book about this kind of stuff, and the response, it's a textbook, and the surprise that we've gotten is so many professors are coming to us saying, this is what we've been looking for, because we didn't know how to teach this or how to explain it. So that's why I'm optimistic.
So can I echo that a little bit? So before coming to Facebook, I was an academic, right? And one of the things that really draws you to places like Facebook, I think going to your point about education, Pedro, is that these companies are now actually facing the problems that were very theoretical before, right? And like the questions around fault tolerance, questions around availability, questions around queuing theory, right? Like all of these things are like stuff that people see in practice today that weren't really there before. So what I've tried to do with as many academic colleagues that I meet when I go to like academic conferences, et cetera, is to like tell them that, hey, like the production side of this stuff is really important. I think one of the best things that we can do is work extremely hard to bridge those gaps, right? So like that means that taking the lessons learned and taking all of this stuff and actually shipping it over to the other side of that boundary, right? Like there's a lot of people that'll sit in an academic room and say, well, there's a magic thing. You finally spin up servers. There's like availability, et cetera. They don't know what it actually means. So taking the war stories here and bridging that gap to either side, and not just you having all these conversations here, I think will help that community a great deal, because a lot of times you'll see professors and stuff do sabbaticals inside Facebook, and they have a hard time ramping up because they're just like overwhelmed with the scale and like how everything works. So I think doing whatever we can to bridge that gap between the communities, I think will have a huge impact.
I think sort of to Philip's talk this morning about don't fear the machine. I mean, my hope would be, as I'm building an SRE organization, if I look out, say, 10 years, you know, if people are still opening IDs and cutting and pasting code all over the place and pulling down hundreds of megabytes of frameworks that we have to all figure out, that's still going to happen, right? But abstracting away everything, like the fact that we're on the cloud and I push a button and I get a server and Amazon did that for me, that's great. You know, it's just something I don't even have to think about. So I would hope that at some point, some of the SRE capability we do, we just abstract away. No one knows what instance type they're on. They don't worry about thread pools. We just figure out a way to make it happen for them and then be comfortable in the fact that the site's up all the time, right? Because there's that balance of how much do I have to educate engineers to know what operation facets they need to know versus I just remove their need to even know about that. And I would hope that we can get more to that point.
Questions?
So I think Pedro said something about like impact. In general, what's your opinion on like what's the impact? Because it's hard to, when you have a product team, you ship something and it goes and destroys the competition and results in growth. It's pretty easy to see impact. But with SRE, how do you guys demonstrate, show impact to the
Yeah, sure. So I'll start since you directed the question to me or comment that I made. I think that in our line of work, the impact is slightly different than like shipping a software and actually seeing it out in production, right? There's a qualitative and then there's a quantitative impact of it. If you actually did something good and it was a force multiplier for the organization, for the team, if it solved an efficiency problem for the developers, if it actually allowed you to reroute around a failure, or you solved a problem that was either out of band or in band to be able to make that service better, then that's what the impact is, right? If you were able to actually then also qualitatively make everybody better as a software engineer, then there is that impact as well. So we have to like balance both of those two. I think that the biggest challenge that we face in terms of like understanding what the impact is of somebody who does something in the background that actually nobody ever really notices until it breaks is the really hard challenge there. So communication, making sure that actually everybody understands when it happened. Earlier on we were talking about like how do you actually prove that the work that you did actually helped. That is a big part of it. You should actually add instrumentation into it. So, for example, we spent a lot of time with our core systems team that built Service Router, so we could route around failures. And we actually instrument every time it does that, right? Like we actually can see every time it said, oh, you're overloaded, I'm going to reroute you over there. And then we can actually see the metrics of those and say, okay, that work that has to do with reliability, we can actually see the direct impact of that.
Fire, and then you like see an opportunity. I think like Rajesh was in some of those conversations when he was in the XDC team. Like we always take for granted, like sometimes we take for granted problems that we have had for a long time, like not like something that breaks consistently all the same way, but things that we think, okay, this is the way life is. In the caching team, for instance, we had this thing about, I'm just using an example here, like, oh, we always shard the data the same way and like split all of this around the same way. So and everybody knows that one of the pains of a caching system is that, you have some machines that are hot and other machines that are cold, and that's how life goes, right? And when you kind of challenge those assumptions, make algorithmic changes and operational changes to actually change those things, and then you see like all of a sudden it's like, oh, and I have a 30% of capacity, I can decide what to do with it. Like when you are looking at thousands and thousands of machines, which I think most of people here are in the 4 digits at least, it's a lot of money, and that's like very obvious impact as well. And of course not everybody has the chance to work on this kind of stuff, but also the force multiplier stuff is like a really good way to go about it.
So one other interesting thing from the incident management talk that I gave earlier was that first issue where we had a data center level power thing. We recognized that because we had spent the time developing a run book and everything like that previous work had just effectively saved us a major user visible issue, right? And it just became like an internal issue, but not an external one. That kind of stuff shows impact as well, right? Like, so you suddenly have something where Facebook it's a very brand specific thing, right? So like Facebook is adversely affect the brand, and Facebook has a very high error rate. But because of the work we did around checklisting and reliability and capacity, et cetera, we've just insulated us from another failure model, right? And that's another way to, like, we've measured impact. And honestly, that work was internally was very well rewarded, right? So that, and it was very well incentivized, and the management spoke very, very highly of it. So it gives good structure and good guidance as to these types of problems are also.
Another thing I'll add is be careful what you're trying to quantify. I think when you talk about impact, getting first agreement sort of the human level, that it matters that the product works and it's reliable, but then saying, okay, how does it actually map into some kind of thing we can track? Like Pedro was saying, looking at human time saved definitely helps. At Netflix, we spent some time trying to quantify the impact of when we have an outage, what do we miss in terms of unmet expectations? So users clicking play, it didn't work, and how does that contribute to them deciding to leave the service? And we found that it's extremely hard to quantify. And we tried to put it like, is it $40 million a year? Is it $50 million a year? And without actually running an A/B test where we actually deny service to a certain number of customers with a certain frequency, it's hard to tell. So we have sort of a general agreement that it matters. We're trying to target 4 nines, but we also apply human judgment where we balance that versus product features.
Given the length of the answers, I think we have time for one more question.
I don't think so.
So, with the amount of information that we're asking our SREs to retain over time, you're going from fire to fire. What we found is it's becoming increasingly difficult to retain some of this information, especially the things that happen not very often. When you mix that in with things that happen very often, a month later, remember you call previously there. We've asked our folks to keep a journal. If something bad happens, if it's a really bad walk away, take a walk afterwards, decompress. We try to reflect, to try to help with that memory recall if this were to happen again. I'm curious to hear from all of you, kind of what you've had your SREs do, what are you doing with that, with memory recall, with information retention?
There is a component there, like that's just like some lights, yellow lights blinked while you were asking your question, is that an SRE organization shouldn't be looking at problems that happen over and over again, because if you are doing that, you are doing something wrong. So you really need to create a mechanism in your organization to make sure that that specific failure, it might be that you're going to see similar things in other teams, but it's very important that you get the circle to close there. Like you have an incident, you learn the lessons, you try to make sure that lesson is spread around your organization as much as it is, because if you are doing 2-3 times, you are just like the same thing, or like, oh, when this happens, this is what I do in a system level, then you are not really, you are just calling your organization like an SRE or a production engineer and stuff like that, and it's not acting like it, right?
You hit the nail on the head. I think we do really effective problem. But it is in terms of similar. So I'm from Yahoo. And when we look at just the quantity of stuff, a lot of it's really similar. A lot of failures are similar, but they're not exactly the same. But that recall still comes into effect. It's like, wait a second, I dealt with something similar a month ago, and I'm looking for more creative ways to help people recall that information.
Training as well.
So, yeah, for us, this is a cross-training thing. We want everyone in the team to be able to do a certain minimum things, even though each of us might be an expert in, their particular aspect of the team. So we have a wiki page for each service, and we use a template so that the same information is recorded about each one. And one of those things is, one of the sections is alerts related to this service, and for each alert, there's basically a checklist of things to try. So I might not be the subject matter expert on Redis on my team, but if I'm on call, I know that this alert means I go through this checklist, and if I get to the end of the checklist, I can escalate to the person who is the person that's the expert in that. If that person feels that they're getting paged too much late at night, they can fix that problem by improving the checklist. If they think well, I always use this example, but luckily I haven't actually seen this anywhere I've worked. But in theory, if someone feels that they're too good to write documentation, you say, that's great. You've just given us, a zero-length checklist means when we get that page, we'll just call you right away. So it creates this forcing function that ends up with checklists that are really the right length.
I definitely had an allergic reaction to you saying my engineers go from fire to fire. So. But one of the things about Andrew's talk that's going on right now that I really, really like, right, is because I have teams that support some very complex components of Google. Specifically, I'm going to think about the abuse system, right, and how many things categorize abuse across all of Google's products, right? The number of systems that they are responsible for, the number of ways that they can go wrong, the impact of that's a huge burden on the individuals in that team. And sometimes, especially new people join your team, and they are just overwhelmed that whether or not they are ready, right? Am I ready? Can I handle the next failure? Regardless of if it's a repeat, because ideally you get to the point where it's never a repeat. And I think one of the things I like about Andrew's training is that one of the first things he wants to teach new people at Google is before we teach you how to engineer, we want to teach you how to reverse engineer, right? So that regardless of the problem, you start to feel confident that you can actually reverse engineer this problem, even if it's on the fly, right? And I think that giving them permission to not know what the answer is and just trust that they can figure it out, because we're going to go through how you reverse engineer something you've never supported before and show that you know how to do that. We hired you, and we're going to teach you how to do that. Can really turn it around so that they'll let go of needing to know everything and just trust in their skills that they have as SREs or whatever you call that role.
I have a question for you. But is your SRE embedded with the devs and share the pager, or Google, they all have the pager and?
No, so our SREs, we have to follow the Sun model, but they are embedded with dev, but we are in essence the on-call.
Can I mini postmortem this with you a little bit? I have some questions for you. While mental acuity and memory recall is actually very important in terms of like.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Yeah, so while memory recall and mental acuity is actually really important for us to be able to do our job day to day, why is that necessary? Why are you doing that?
Well, it's more of an enhancement than it is anything else. I mean, we're asking, in general, I think we're asking our folks to do more and more every day. And trying to figure out creative ways is how do we enable that?
Yeah, I guess my question would be a little bit different, which is, if you need to recall an incident that happened a couple of months ago to be able to do your job today, it means you didn't follow up on the action items that you had to do to solve that problem, and the engineering team isn't supporting you to actually solve that problem. So that may be your root cause. You may, over time, if you can solve those problems from those root causes and those follow action items, then your team won't be going from fire to fire. They won't be mentally exhausted, and this problem won't actually exist as badly as it does today.
Yeah, and also I echo what Sabrina said too. I think for me, like the troubleshooting and like being able to like diagnose it from first principles is like the most important thing. If you can approach the problem from first principles and never like, I think I fundamentally believe that there's no difference between a DBA and an SRE and a DBA. Like there's not a difference in skill set. It's just how you apply this, like from first principles, how the system is built. And if you can do that, you can figure out any system. There's only probably 3 or 4 classes of problems you'll ever see. Like now, if you can approach them in different ways, but like once you've seen them, like it's all the same. It's just a different application you're running. There's nothing different in running Apache versus MySQL versus like Postgres. Like they're just different applications. And like if you can debug any of them, you can debug the next one.
All right, so I want to thank you guys because I think we are out of time. That is people already getting into the dock. Thank you very much. Thank you our speakers that hang around and been here. Thank you.